Divine enlightenment is everything. I often tell people arrange matters as God enlightens you. When I say as God enlightens you, I mean that man must view things with divine enlightenment and not through human rationality. One must not think that whatever makes one feel comfortable is also the enlightenment of God. How does divine enlightenment come to us? If we burnish the wires, the sinful man can become a good conductor, and then the grace of God will be transmitted to provide the divine light of grace. Otherwise, the system is short-circuited and grace cannot enter. The basic thing is for man to take care not to lose the grace of God, so as to have divine enlightenment. For everything is in vain if there is no divine enlightenment. What difficulties Christ had with his earthly disciples, until they were overshadowed by divine grace. Before Pentecost, authority was given to the disciples to help the people, but they did not yet have the divine enlightenment which they received at Pentecost. When Christ told his disciples that he was going to Jerusalem and the Son of Man was going to be crucified and raised, and so forth, they imagined that when he arrived in Jerusalem the people would raise him up to be king. They were thinking in human terms. This is why they were concerned as to who would sit at the right side or at the left side of Christ. The mother of the sons of Zebedee went to Jesus and asked that he place one of her sons at his right and the other at his left. But from the day of Pentecost, when Christ sent the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, the apostles received divine grace forever. Prior to that, they had divine enlightenment only on occasion. It was like their batteries were charged but would run down again. They needed to be plugged into an electrical outlet and be recharged. Again and again they would run out. Again and again they needed to be recharged. When the Paraclete was sent to the apostles, they no longer needed to be recharged. It's not that we are now better and they were worse, but rather that we are now living in the time of grace. And this means that we have no excuses. We are baptized, we have the Holy Spirit through chrismation, we have it all. Back then Christ had not yet been crucified, and in a way the devil still had some authority and could easily mislead the people. Following the crucifixion, Christ granted to all the ability to receive divine enlightenment. Christ sacrificed himself and liberated us. We are now baptized in his name. The electrical outlet is now permanently in place. Now it is we who are interrupting the passage of divine grace. And this is because we let the wires get rusty. Geronda, what is required for the Holy Spirit to dwell in man? A fighting spirit, humility, philorimo, nobility, and sacrifice are some of the requirements. Man is worthless without the grace of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the light, the divine light. The whole basis is there. If someone cannot see, he may walk into a window, walk off a cliff or into a ditch. He cannot see where he is going, because he lacks the necessary light. But if he sees a small ray of light, he can protect himself. If he sees even more clearly, he can avoid all the dangers and walk safely on his way. And for the light to come, one must be willing to come out of the darkness. Even if people see poorly, they will not fall, and God will not be displeased. If a father is troubled and worried over his children falling into mud, into thorny bushes or off a cliff, imagine how much even more God himself is troubled over us. All the evil in the world exists where divine enlightenment is lacking, and when divine enlightenment is lacking, man is in darkness. Then one person says, "Let's go this way," and the other says, "No, I know better, this is the way we must go," and so it goes, this way, no that way. Each person thinks it is better to go his way. In other words, they are all interested in going the right way, but they are all in a sort of confusion and cannot come to a mutual understanding. If there were no confusion, they would not be arguing, they would have recognized the best way and would take that direction. I mean to say that everyone may have a good disposition, but given the confusion, Many problems are created in society and in the church. At least in the church, most people do not have a bad disposition, but they do lack divine enlightenment. They struggle for the good, but where do they end up? For this reason, we must ask God to grant us even a little divine enlightenment. Otherwise, we will constantly stumble as if we were blind. In the divine liturgy, when the priest says, "We offer to you your own from your own," I pray to God that He provide light for the people to see. A small ray of light provided by God can dispel the darkness, keep the people from spiritually crippling themselves in the darkness. During the reading of the second psalm, which Saint Arsenius of Cappadocia read as a prayer to God to enlighten those going to conferences, I pray, may God enlighten all the leaders of the world, enlighten all the hierarchs and fathers of the Church to receive the Holy Spirit, so as to be able to help the people of the world. Even if a single one is enlightened and others become at least receptive, can you imagine what great good could be achieved? One timely word spoken by a leader can make a big difference. People have a need for divine enlightenment. The benevolent God provides His divine enlightenment to those who have good intentions. A judge once related a case which he had encountered personally. A monk was sent by his monastery with 500 gold coins to buy a field. He went to ask a real estate broker, who said to him, "Leave the gold coins with me so you don't have to carry them." So he left the money with the broker. "What a nice man," the monk thought innocently in his heart. "He relieved me of that burden." When the monk returned, the broker not only did not give him back the coins, but even claimed that he had given the monk 8 million drachmas. The poor monk thought how he would return to the monastery. Not only had he given the 500 coins and received nothing in return, but the broker was demanding an additional 8 million drachmas. The matter ended up in court. At a trial, the judge had the inspiration to ask a series of questions whose answers not only proved that the broker had not given anything to the monk, but that he had also taken the gold coins. I was able to see that the judge was in a spiritual state similar to that of the prophet Daniel, as he had the fear of God in his heart. God illuminated him to act appropriately and uphold justice. The whole basis is divine enlightenment. When divine enlightenment comes, then not only are the person and his environment at peace and at ease, but he himself can continue to make spiritual progress. This is why I keep saying that while the lights and the chandeliers, these impressive discoveries of the mind, are nice and useful, the divine light of the grace of God, which enlightens man, is superior. The person who has divine enlightenment can see things very clearly. He is well informed without doubts and can positively help others without becoming weary.